Gordon Houlden is the director of the China Institute, professor of political science and adjunct professor of the Alberta School of Business at the University of Alberta. And he has a long history in the Canadian Foreign Service, and he joins me now. Professor Houlden, thanks for joining me today to talk about this situation. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Let's begin with the frank talk from the Chinese, I guess we got today. The most overt indication so far that no one in the Chinese leadership will be speaking with Justin Trudeau about the diplomatic freeze between the two countries until Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou is released. How should the Canadian government be responding to what sounds like an ultimatum?
Well, it's an ongoing ultimatum, and we knew already that, for example, Mr. Freeland was unable to speak with her Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, and now the Prime Minister has been given the same stiff arm. It's a public rebuke, which is, in my view, more serious than a private through channels rebuke, or at least put off. It answers the question which some have been saying, pick up the phone and call the Chinese president. Chinese don't operate that way, and particularly not with what they view as a smaller power. It certainly is a smaller power.
So what would be the consequences of bowing to the Chinese demand to release Meng Wanzhou?
Well, to be honest, I don't think it's actually within the gift of the Canadian government at this point. The Prime Minister lacks the power, legal authority, to pick up the phone and ask the Justice of the Extradition hearing in Vancouver to release her. A Canadian Prime Minister can't just call the judge and call it off. There will be a couple opportunities. One is that the extradition court itself could release her, or when it's concluded, the Minister of Justice has the opportunity, if he should so choose, to determine this was a politicized process and then reject it, although that would have serious consequences for our relationship with the United States. Another possibility would be that the U.S. would simply drop the extradition request. And with President Trump, that's always a possibility, I suppose.
Well, I guess that's interesting because Justin Trudeau will sit down with President Trump next week from today, in fact. Is it something that a Canadian Prime Minister can raise with the U.S. President? Or another way of getting at it, I guess, is there a way to gauge how serious the U.S. is about, A, pushing through with the extradition process, or perhaps considering dropping it if it means they can get a trade deal with China? Does that come up in their conversation, do you think?
I'm certain that the Meng/Huawei case will come up. Certainly, and the Prime Minister has the ability to do that. He can't call the judge, but he certainly can speak to Trump. My view is that the U.S. authorities, and I was in Washington in April, are pretty hard set to proceed with extradition. The question mark would be President Trump, who is a wheeler dealer. He's speculated twice now about deals that might be made regarding Huawei. As recently as this week, he mused that perhaps something could be worked out with Huawei. Now, he could have been referring to Huawei being shut out of the U.S. market. He could have been referring to a possible arrangement vis-a-vis Ms. Meng. He's someone who values family very highly. I could imagine how he might identify with the daughter of the founder being detained in Canada. But that's my speculation. I have no idea what he'll do, and he's very hard to predict.
Yeah, no kidding. Or do you want to get a sense of how, as you say, how tightly wedded he is to the notion of following through with this extradition process, so that Canada knows what it's in store for, that there's no likelihood that the U.S. would back down? And I guess if that's the case, where do you see the story going if the release of these Canadians being held in China is predicated entirely now on releasing Meng Wanzhou? How does this thing resolve?
Well, if the Americans, and particularly President Trump, is determined to press on with the extradition request, then I believe we're in for a very, very long, minimum months, potentially years, judicial process where things would not be able to be normalized. I feel particularly badly for the two detainees who are being held in difficult conditions. But there's also Canadian farmers and business people who are suffering, and that means indirectly Canadians who are employed on those farms and in those businesses who are suffering from the de facto Chinese economic retaliation against us. I say de facto because they never do us the courtesy of identifying that this is being done because of MENG.
Right.
But those sanctions are real.
Let's finish on this. We have this Globe and Mail story now floating around that says former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien is floating that idea of having Canada cancel the extradition process and releasing Mrs. Meng. That would put him in line with what the Chinese are demanding. What's your reaction to that, and how do you think that affects that story's out publicly? How do you think that affects Canada's argument that, look, this is a rule of law issue with no political involvement?
I think it would be very controversial in this country, and I'm not an extradition lawyer. I'm not sure precisely, given that it's been lodged in the court, how that would be accomplished until the hearing is ended. And then, under the extradition treaty, there are ways to do that. Now, Parliament's sovereign; they can change laws, they can change regulations. Canada has the sovereign power to change course. But where you would improve relations with China, you'd harm relations with the United States, and I think it would be domestically a very hot potato.
All right, Gordon Houlden, always appreciate your perspective. Thanks again for tonight.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.